Sorry, my video is late, guys. I had to get some groceries and take my roommates to work. I'm going to be reading chapters 20, 21, and 22 today. Chapter 20. It was pouring when George walked home that afternoon. Cold splats of water hurtled down from the dark gray skies as he trudged along. Cars dived through the big puddles at the edge of the road, sending tidal waves of dirty water swooshing over the pavement. By the time George reached his own street, he was shivering with cold. He got as far as Eric's door and hovered anxiously on the doorstep. He was longing to ring the bell and ask the scientist to help him with his talk for the next day. And he also wanted to find out why Dr. Reaper might think he had disappeared. But he was worried Eric would still be angry with him and send him away. To ring or not to ring? What to do? The skies were getting darker and darker, and suddenly he heard a huge clap of thunder. The rain got even heavier, and George made up his mind. It was important to ask Eric about his talk and tell him about Dr. Reaper. He decided to be brave, and ring the bell. Bing bong! He waited for a few seconds, and nothing happened. Just as he was wondering whether to ring again, the door flew open, and Eric's head popped out. "George," he said in delight, "it's you! Come in!" He reached out a long arm and whisked George inside, shutting the front door with a brisk slam. To his great surprise, George found himself standing in Eric's hallway, with his coat wet, dripping onto the bare floorboards. "I'm so sorry," he stammered. "For what?" said Eric, looking a little startled. "What have you done?" "About Annie, and the comet, and Cosmos," George reminded him. "Oh, that," said Eric. "I'd forgotten all about it. But now that you've mentioned it, don't worry. Annie told me that it was her idea, not yours, and that she made you go into outer space. I take it that's true?" He looked at George over his heavy glasses, his bright eyes twinkling. Yes, actually it is," said George with relief. "So really," Eric continued, "I should be saying sorry to you for jumping to the wrong conclusion. Instead of considering all the evidence, I just applied some common sense, otherwise known as prejudice, and came up with a totally wrong answer." George didn't really understand all of this, so he just nodded. From the library, he could hear the sounds of voices. "Are you having a party?" he asked. "Well, yes, a kind of party," said Eric. "It's a party of scientists, so we like to call it a conference. Why don't you come in and listen? You might be interested. We're talking about Mars. Annie's had to miss it, I'm afraid, as she's still at her granny's. You can tell her about it if you stay." "Oh, yes, please," said George, forgetting in his excitement to ask about his talk or tell Eric about Dr. Reaper. As he took off his wet coat and followed Eric into the library, he could hear a woman's voice. "This is the reason why my colleagues and I strongly advocate a thorough search of our closest neighbor, who knows, in the end, what we may find by digging underneath the red surface." Eric and George tiptoed into the library. It looked quite different from the last time George had seen it. All the books were neatly arranged on shelves, pictures of the universe hung on the wall in frames, and in the corner lay a pile of carefully folded spacesuits. In the middle of the room, on rows of chairs, sat a group of scientists who were all different shapes and sizes and looked like they had come from all over the world. Eric showed George to a seat, a finger pressed to his lips to show George that he should keep very quiet. Standing at the front of the room was the speaker, a tall, beautiful woman with a braid of thick red hair so long it reached right down past her waist. Her green eyes glittered as she smiled at the scientists gathered for the conference. Just above her head, Cosmos' window portal was showing a red planet. The red-haired speaker continued her talk. Isn't it highly probable that evidence of life, had life existed on Mars in a long time ago times, is not there for us to find on the surface? We should never forget that every now and then sandstorms radically alter the planet's surface, burying deeper and deeper beneath layers of inorganic dust the entire past of our red neighbor. As she spoke, they all saw through Cosmos' window an enormous sandstorm that took over the whole surface of the red planet. Eric bent his head toward George and whispered, "What she means is that even if there was once life on Mars, we wouldn't see it on the surface today. In fact, I can tell you, this scientist strongly believes there was life on Mars at some stage. She sometimes even declares that there is still life there. That would be one of the most amazing discoveries of all times, but we can't say much more than that at this stage. We need to get onto this beautiful red planet ourselves to find out." George was talking to ask George was about to ask why Mars was red, but realized the speaker was finishing her talk. Do you have any questions before we have a short break? She asked her audience. After that, we will discuss our last and most important issue. George felt very sad that he had only heard the end of the talk, so he raised his hand to ask something. Meanwhile, all the scientists were murmuring, "Oh, snacks!" None of them wanted to ask a question. "So let's have our well-deserved break then," said Eric, who hadn't spotted George's raised hand. The scientists rushed over to the tea cart in the corner of the room, anxious to nab all the jelly donuts before others could grab them. But the red-haired speaker had noticed George's thin arm waving in the air. "Well, well," she said, looking at George. "Colleagues, we do have a question after all, and it's from our new fellow down here." The other scientists turned and looked at George. When they saw how small he was, they all smiled and brought their coffee and pastries back to their seats. "What would you like to know?" asked the speaker. Please, if you don't mind," said George, suddenly feeling very shy. He was wondering if his question was a really stupid one and whether everyone would laugh at him. He took a deep breath. "Why is Mars red?" he asked. "Good question," said one of the other scientists, blowing on his tea. George breathed a sigh of relief. Professor Kurzak, the red-haired speaker, whose name no one ever managed to pronounce, nodded and started to give George an answer. "If you walk through the hills and mountains here on Earth, you can sometimes see red patches of ground that are not covered with any plants. This is true, for instance, in the Grand Canyon in the United States, but there are many other places where this also is the case. The ground is this red color because there is iron there that has rusted. When iron becomes oxidized, which is another way of saying that it has rusted, it becomes red. It is because of this presence of rusted iron, that the surface of Mars is red." "Do you mean that Mars is made of iron?" asked George. "Well, not quite. Since we sent some robots to Mars, we know that it's just a thin layer of rusted iron powder that gives Mars its red color. It seems that underneath the layer of the red dust, the surface of Mars may be quite similar to the surface of Earth, without the water, that is." "So there's no water on Mars?" "There is, but the water we know of is not liquid. On Mars, it's far too hot during the day. Any water turns into vapor and is lost, so the only places where water can remain are those where the temperature always remains cold, day and night, so that water can freeze and remain frozen. This happens at the poles. At the North Pole of Mars, we have found large quantities of frozen water, ice. It is the same on Earth, where large ice reservoirs can be found at the poles in the Arctic and Antarctic. Does this answer your question?" "Yes. Thank you," said George. He was just busy thinking up another question when Eric stood up at the front of the room, next to the speaker. "Thank you, Professor Kurzak," he said, "for your very interesting paper on Mars." Professor Kurzak bowed and went to take her seat. "Dear friends and colleagues," continued Eric, "before we move on to the last and most important issue we have to discuss, let me thank you all for making the effort to get here. Some of you have come from far across the globe, but I know the talks we have heard today have made the journey worthwhile. I'm sure I don't need to remind you how important it is that the existence of Cosmos stays very closely guarded secret." The group nodded its agreement. "Now," continued Eric, "the question we all came to answer is a question of fundamental interest for everyone who is involved in science. We all know far too well how it can be used for evil purposes, and that is why we have all taken the oath of the scientists, so that science is used only for the good of humanity. But we are now facing a dilemma. As you heard in the news and saw at the environmental march on Saturday, more and more people are concerned about the state of the Earth. So the question we now have to answer is, should we concentrate on finding ways to improve life on Earth and face its problems, or should we try to find another planet for humanity to inhabit?" All scientists in the room were silent and looked very serious. George watched them as they wrote an answer on a little piece of paper. Eric then collected the papers in a hat. In total, including Eric and the red-haired speaker, the 8 scientists had voted. Eric then started to open up the papers one by one. The Earth. The Earth. Another planet. Another planet. Another planet. The Earth. The Earth. Another planet. "Well, well," said Eric, "it seems we have a split vote." The red-haired Professor Kurzak, put up her hand. "May I make a suggestion?" she asked. Everyone else nodded. She got to her feet. George, she said, addressing the boy directly, we may lack a bit of perspective in this matter because we are all specialists in our field, so could you maybe tell us what you think about it? All the scientists were looking at him now. George felt very shy and stayed silent for a few seconds. Say what you really think, whispered Professor Kurzak. Twisting his fingers in his lap, George thought about his parents and the Green campaigners. He then thought about the excitement of traveling in space and trying to find another home out there. And then he heard himself say to the scientist, "Why can't you do both?" Chapter 21. George, you are absolutely right, Eric said as they waved goodbye to all the scientists who were leaving now that the conference had come to an end. George and Eric went back into the library, which was covered in cake crumbs, half-drunken cups of coffee, old pens, and conference papers folded into airplane shapes. We need to work on saving this planet and looking for a new one. We don't have to do one or the other. Do you think you will? Asked George. You and your friends? Do both, I mean? Oh, yes, I think so, said Eric. Maybe we could invite your parents to our next conference. Do you know, George, I heard your father's talk at the climate protest march the other day. Maybe he has some good ideas we could use. Oh, no, don't do that, said George, panicking. He wasn't at all sure that his father would approve of Eric and his friendly scientist. I don't think he'd like that. He might surprise you, said Eric. We all need to work together to save the planet if we're going to get anything done. He started to clear up some of the mess the scientists had made. They seemed to have left behind an extraordinary number of things, jackets, hats, sweaters, and even a shoe. It was very nice of you to drop by to apologize, said Eric, gathering together to a great armful of abandoned clothing. Well, actually, admitted George, that's not quite why I came around. Eric dumped the clothes in a corner of the room and turned back to look at him. I signed up for a science competition, the boy continued, nervously. It's sort of like your conference, except it's kids giving the talks, and there's a big computer as first prize. I've tried to write something to say, but I'm really worried I've made lots of mistakes and everyone will laugh at me. Yes, Annie told me about your competition, said Eric, looking serious, and I've got something that might help you. Funnily enough, I had an idea after your comet ride. I decided to start writing a book about the universe for you and Annie. I made some notes. They might help you with your science presentation. He picked up a plate of cookies. Have one of these. Brain food. George helped himself to what was left of the cookies. How about this for an idea, said Eric thoughtfully. If you could just give me a hand to get my library straightened up a bit. Annie's left me strict instructions that I'm not to make the house messy while she's away. Well, then we can talk about your science presentation and I'll go through the notes I made for you. Does that sound like a fair deal? Oh, yes, said George, delighted by Eric's promise. What would you like me to do? Oh, perhaps a little sweeping or something like that, said Eric vaguely. He leaned casually on a wobbly pile of chairs as he spoke, accidentally pushing them over with a loud crash. George burst out laughing. You can see why I need help, said Eric apologetically, but his eyes were twinkling with laughter. I'll pick up these chairs and maybe you could brush a bit of this mud off the floor. Would you mind? The carpet was covered in footprints left by the scientists, none of whom ever remembered to wipe their feet on the doormat. Not at all, said George, stuffing the last cookie into his mouth and running off to the kitchen where he found a dustpan and brush. He came back into the library and started to swish away at some of the worst bits of dirt. As he worked, a piece of paper stuck to his brush. He picked it off the bristles and was about to throw it away, and then he realized it was a letter addressed to Eric. There was something strangely familiar about the handwriting. Look at this. He passed the note to Eric. Someone must have dropped it. Eric took the piece of paper and unfolded it while George kept on sweeping. Suddenly, he heard a great shout. Eureka! Cried Eric. George looked up. Eric was just standing there, piece of paper in hand, a joyous look on his face. What's going on? George asked him. I've just been giving the most amazing piece of information, cried Eric. If this is correct, he peered at the piece of paper again, holding it up very close to his thick glasses. He muttered a long string of numbers to himself. What is it? Asked George. Hang on. Eric seemed to be calculating something in his head. He ticked off a series of points on his fingers, scrunched up his face, and scratched his head. Yes, he said, yes. He stuffed the paper into his pockets, then picked up George up off his feet and whirled him around. George, I've got the answer. I think I know. Suddenly dropping him again, Eric went over to Cosmos and started typing. What do you know? Said George, who was a little dizzy. Great shooting stars. This is fantastic. Eric was frantically tapping on the computer's keyboard. A huge flash of light shot out of Cosmo's screen into the middle of the room, and George saw that the great computer was once more making a doorway. "Where are you going?" George asked. Eric was struggling into a spacesuit, but he was in such a hurry that he put both feet into one pant leg and fell over. George hauled himself up again and helped him on with his suit. "So exciting," said Eric, who was now feeling rather alarmed. "The letter, George, the letter. It might be it. This might be what we've been looking for." "Who was the letter from?" asked George, who had a bad feeling in his stomach, although he didn't know why. "I'm not sure," admitted Eric. "It doesn't really say." "Then you shouldn't trust it," said George. "Don't be silly, George," said Eric. "I expect it was written by someone at the conference who wanted me to check out the information using Cosmos. I expect they wanted to know it was correct before they announced it to the whole scientific community." "Then why didn't they just ask you directly? Why write a letter?" persisted George. Because, said Eric, sounding a little annoyed. "They probably had a good reason, which I'll find out when I get back from my trip." George saw that Cosmo's screen was now covered in long strings of numbers. "What are those?" he asked. "Those are the coordinates of my new journey," said Eric. "Are you going now?" asked George sadly. "What about my science presentation?" Eric stopped in his tracks. "Oh, George, I am sorry," he exclaimed, "but I really have to go. It's important. It's too important to wait." "Your talk will be fine without me. You'll see." "But, no buts, George," said Eric, putting on his glass space helmet and speaking in his funny space voice once more. "Thank you so much for finding that letter. It has given me a vital clue. Now I must go. Goodbye." Eric leaped through the portal doorway and was gone into outer space before George had time to say another word. The portal slammed shut behind him, and George was left alone in the library. Chapter 22. After the door to outer space closed, there was a moment of deathly silence in the library. It was broken by the sound of a tune playing very faintly in the background. George looked around to see who might be humming, but then he realized it was Cosmos, singing a little song to himself as he crunched the long string of numbers that were flashing across the screen. "Bop, bop, bop, bop," tooted Cosmos. "Cosmos," said George, who wasn't feeling very happy about Eric's sudden departure. He certainly didn't feel like whistling a merry tune. "Toom-tee-toom-toom," said Cosmos in reply. "Cosmos," repeated George. "Where has Eric gone?" "Tra-la-la-la," Cosmos went on cheerfully, rolling reams of endless numbers across his screen. "Cosmos," said George once more, this time with more urgency. "Stop singing. Where has Eric gone?" The computer stopped mid-hum. "He has gone to find a new planet," he said, sounding rather surprised. "I'm sorry you don't like my music," he continued. I was just singing while I worked. Pum-pa-pum-pum," he started again. "Cosmos!" yelled George. "Where is he?" "Well, that's hard to say," replied Cosmos. "How come you don't know?" said George, surprised. "I thought you knew everything." "Unfortunately, not. I do not know what I have not been shown." "Do you mean Eric is lost?" "No, not lost. His travels uncover new places for me. I follow him and I map the universe." "All right," said George, relieved to know that Eric wasn't lost. "Fine. I suppose it must be something very special that he's gone to see for him to rush off like that." No, interrupted Cosmos. "Just another undiscovered part of the universe, all in a day's work." George felt a bit confused. If that was the case, why had Eric just shot off into outer space in such a great hurry? He'd thought that Eric was his friend and that, unlike other adults, he would explain that he was up to and why. But he hadn't. He had just gone. For a split second, George wondered about grabbing a spacesuit, asking Cosmos to open the portal, and joining Eric. But then he remembered how furious Eric had been after he and Annie had gone into outer space without his permission. He suddenly realized sadly that he would just have to go home now. Maybe Eric wasn't really his friend at all, but just another grown-up who didn't think it mattered whether George understood stuff or not. He picked up his wet coat and school bag and made for the door. Cosmos was still humming his little melody in the background. George opened Eric's front door to leave. He was just about to step out into the street when he had a sudden flash of memory. There had been 2 reasons he had come to see Eric today, and he'd only managed to tell him about one of them. The science competition. All in the excitement, he'd completely forgotten to warn Eric about Dr. Reaper and the strange questions. The letter! George now remembered. It's Greeper. George had overheard him asking the bullies to deliver a note. That must be the letter Eric received. And Reaper asked if Eric had disappeared. George turned and rushed straight back into the house, leaving the door wide open behind him. In the library, Cosmos was still at work. On the desk in front of him, George spotted the letter that Eric had read with such joy. He read the whole thing, his hands shaking as he realized who had written it. Dear Eric, I understand that your long-standing quest to find a new planet to inhabit isn't yet over. I wanted to draw your attention to a very particular planet I happen to have found. It is roughly the size of Earth and lies about the same distance from its star as the Earth is from the Sun. As far as I know, there has never been such a strong candidate planet for humans to settle on. I am pretty sure it has an atmosphere like ours, an atmosphere we could breathe. I am not in a position to verify this information, but I very much look forward to hearing what you think of it. Please see below for the coordinates of that planet, or rather, a way to reach it. Scientifically yours, G.R. George knew perfectly well who G.R. was. The handwriting was all too familiar to him. He recognized it from his school reports, which usually said things like, George will amount to nothing unless he learns to pay attention in class and stop daydreaming. It was without a doubt written by Dr. Reaper. And Greeper knows Cosmos exists. It must be a trap, George thought. Cosmos, he said out loud, interrupting the computer who was now humming. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. You have to take me to Eric right now. Can you find him? I can try, replied Cosmos. A succession of images appeared on the screen. The first one looked like a starfish with long arms twisted to some sort of spiral. Above it was written, Our galaxy, the Milky Way. Our galaxy, the Milky Way, is made of approximately 200 billion stars, Cosmos started. Our star, the Sun, is only one of them. That's it.